So, The Last of Us Season 1 just ended, and goddamn is it good. Now, something you might not know about me is that I like video games, and I especially like story-driven video games. You know, games that play out like movies or TV shows. And when it comes to The Last of Us, I can comfortably say that it is my favorite story in video games, and one of my favorite stories in general. Yeah, there are a lot of other stories across media that I like, but I don't know, there's just something about The Last of Us that makes me feel so fucking good, man. I seriously love it. I'm obsessed with the video game, and when I saw that they were making an adaptation for TV, I was so fucking hyped and ready, and as it turns out, it's a pretty great adaptation. There were some things that I thought were just perfect and flat out loved, some things that I had some thoughts on, but overall I was pretty happy with this first season and how it adapted the first game. But let's look at it in a little more detail. So the first episode starts off with a late night talk show where they talk about the cordyceps fungus and it mutating to turn people into zombies. And I thought this was a pretty smart way to start things off, because it shows what the overarching problem of this world will be and what everything will revolve around. This scene also does a good job with setting an ominous tone going forward. Then we see the Millers, and this will be where I pissed some people off, because when it came to the casting for this show in general, I didn't know if I entirely liked it at first. Now, all things considered, I think the cast all deliver some pretty good performances, but as a purist who may look at the finer details of the game and want things to match up exactly and may nitpick a bit for that reason, there are some things with just about every character that don't exactly line up with the game. Whether it's physical appearance or little things in their personality that don't give me the same vibe I got from their video game counterpart, there are some things that just don't entirely work for me. And granted, I know it's kind of a lot to ask for an exact match from the video game to the show, and there are even some things that they outright do change that I think actually work better than the game, but like I said, as a diehard fan of the game, I just can't help but look for these little things. For instance, when they initially announced that this show was being made, my first pick for the casting of Joel was Hugh Jackman. I actually think that was a lot of people's first choice to play Joel because Jackman just has that grizzled father look to him. Plus, he's practically done this type of role before in his Wolverine movie, Logan. He looks like Joel, he's already played the reluctant father to the cute, dangerous little girl. He's just perfect to play the part, but they went with Pedro Pascal, which is fine because I think he delivers a good enough performance as Joel. He's coincidentally also done a sort of Guardian type role before, and he does kind of look like him, so it's not really a big deal. Joel's brother, Tommy, looks nothing like his video game counterpart, but weirdly enough, sounds just like him. Like, it's really weird how he sounds so much like the video game version of Tommy. I seriously thought for a second that that was just his voice actor playing the role. Joel's daughter, Sarah, looks nothing like her video game counterpart, but more than makes up for it by being an even better version of the Sarah that exists in the game. In the game, we only get to know Sarah for like a few minutes, but in the show, we get to spend more time with her as we see her go to school, get her dad's birthday present, and visit her neighbors. And that's the type of expansion on this story that's not in the game, but I'm really glad is in the show, because it helps add to the viewer's experience with getting to know the character and feeling more for them when something bad happens to them. When you spend more time with somebody, you're just naturally going to feel more for them than a person you may have known for only a few minutes, and that's what this show makes sure of, is that we feel more for Sarah by spending more time with her than we did in the game. The show also does a good job with building tension in the time that we spend with Sarah, and it reaches a crescendo when we encounter our first infected. And I gotta say, the infected in this show are all great. They look so accurate to the game and are so terrifying that I was so happy with how they were handled in the show. Speaking of looking accurate to the game, the moment when I thought to myself, holy shit, they're really making this look like the video game, was when Sarah got into the backseat of Tommy's truck and we switched to a first-person POV, just like the game, and we see the burning building, the clogged highways, the people panicking in the city. It all just made me go, oh, hey, it's this part, or it's that part, or man, that looks so good, because they really just did a great job with making it feel like the game through the environment and the dialogue. And again, as a purist of the game, that's something I appreciated throughout the whole series. But Sarah dies, we do a time skip, we meet Tess, who also doesn't look like her video game counterpart, and and this is where I start to have a little bit of a problem, because they start changing certain elements of the story, and a lot of these changes don't really feel necessary. For instance, Joel mentions how he can't contact Tommy and how he needs to find him to make sure he's safe, which is not how it happened in the game, and it doesn't need to be this way either, because in the game, Joel goes to Tommy strictly for Tommy to take Ellie off of his hands. That still happens in the show, but they had this extra thing where Joel needed to make sure Tommy was safe, and the problem with this is that it leads to extra scenes like this, where Joel tells this guy that he needs to find his brother, and all the while I kept thinking about how this whole scene didn't even really need to be in the show, because Joel could just as easily use his handing Ellie off to Tommy as the sole motivation for finding him. The radio distress call code thing with Bill that Ellie cracked during this episode also didn't really feel necessary, because Joel goes to Bill in the game solely to ask for his help in getting Ellie across the country. And that's the problem, is that in the show, they make it seem like Joel needs more reasons to go to these people, whether it's because he wants to make sure they're safe or because he heard a distress call come through the radio, which didn't even happen in the show either, so the whole distress call thing just felt pointless. But one change I did like was this whole thing with the soldier that knew Joel, because it ties back to his relationship with Sarah and is good for fleshing out Joel's character more as a guy who's dealing with a lot of repressed trauma. We also meet Ellie this episode, and I will say that when I initially saw Bella Ramsey in the trailer and I realized that they were going to be playing Ellie, I had my reservations. I figured they could probably act enough like Ellie, but I didn't know if I would be able to get over the fact that Bella looks nothing like Ellie. Now, you might be wondering why I'm focusing on the appearances of these actors so much, and I've said this before, but while I don't think an actor should be bullied for not looking like the character they're portraying or for any reason in general, I still think that if you're going to focus on making sure the story and the setting and the dialogue and all these other things match the source material, you should also make sure the characters match as much as possible. And like I said earlier, I know it's kind of a lot to ask for a one-to-one casting of the character, but again, I look at everything to see if it matches up. That's not to say appearance is the main thing I look at though. Sometimes an actor's performance can really overshadow the fact that they might not look like their character, which is very much the case for Bella, but I'll get into that later. Also, this is the last time I'm going to be talking about the resemblance of the actor to the character. At some point, I kind of just accepted the fact that a lot of the actors were not going to look like their video game counterparts. So in the next episode, we get into the virus's origins in Jakarta, and initially I was worried that this was how we were going to start every episode, was with the scene that sort of took us away from the main story to give us a little more background on certain things, which I don't necessarily love, because sometimes I just want to jump right back into the story where we left off and not have to watch anything else, but thankfully it doesn't really happen again. And I will say that this scene is kind of interesting as far as seeing how this whole thing started, but we get this whole scene and then the intro, which I feel like I should mention at least once, is absolutely perfect, from them using the main theme music to what is happening on the screen as the opening credits roll, and then we get a shot of Ellie. And I feel like now's a good time to really talk about Ellie, because it was this episode where I really started having some thoughts about her. I thought Bella did a good enough job portraying Ellie in the first episode. They acted a lot like Ellie and all that, and that's great. But it was in this episode that I started seeing some problems. Because while Joel and Ellie's initial relationship was never all that warm, I feel like they act a little extra snappy and a little extra prickly in the show. And it makes sense for Joel because he's supposed to be a bit of a hard ass, but Ellie is supposed to be like this spunky, cute girl. That's not to say that she doesn't throw the occasional witty or sarcastic remark every once in a while, but it just felt like she was being unnecessarily sarcastic in this episode, to the point where it got a bit annoying. And that's one thing I will say about video game Ellie, is that she never annoyed me. But TV Ellie was so snappy and sarcastic that I honestly just started seeing her not as a spunky, cute kid, but as this annoying teenager. Some other things I didn't like was this idea that they introduced where the infected are all connected, and how if you kill one of them, dozens of others from a mile away will know where you are, because it makes me start thinking about certain situations, like later when they do the DLC episode with Riley and Ellie and they kill this one infected. I start thinking about why other infected haven't run into this mall where they spend some time in after they kill that one infected. Are you telling me that there was just no other infected in the immediate surrounding area? I get that they felt like they probably had to do this to get this episode's ending to follow the game's narrative, but I don't know. I still feel like you could have found another way to do this ending where Joel, Tess, and Ellie get swarmed and Joel and Ellie have to leave Tess behind. This episode is also where we really get to see the environment in broad daylight, and I have to say, it looks so damn good. It looks exactly like the game. It's great. Sometimes though, the buildings seem a bit digitized. Like, I love how it looks like the game, but sometimes it just doesn't look real. It doesn't look like a real building. It looks like it was digitally created or at least manipulated. But other than those things, everything else was just solid. They did a great job with building tension, the fight scenes were nerve-wracking, the clickers looked perfect, and this episode ends exactly the way it should, with Tess going out to buy Joel and Ellie some time, and we're left with this somber tone. Then comes the next episode, and oh boy, am I excited to talk about this episode. Because this was the episode that they said they were going to diverge from the game the most, and I was interested to see how they would do it. And I have to say, for the most part, I quite liked it. And so did a lot of other people, because I remember the week this episode came out and people were losing their shit at this love story. The story of Bill and Frank. And while I do love this story and think that it's tragically beautiful, I'm going to be a butthead again and say what my problems were with this episode. I think the only real problem I have with this episode is the pacing. And not so much like the pacing of the episode, but the pacing of the whole season with the episode in it. Because for the past 2 episodes and for the rest of the season, we follow Joel and Ellie as they steadily make their way across the US, but when we get to this episode, the story of Joel and Ellie just comes to a screeching halt as we watch a love story between 2 characters who honestly never got any real screen time together in the game. Because in the game, our introduction to Bill actually blends into Joel and Ellie's journey. We meet Bill and have a couple of cool, badass fight scenes with him, some humorous moments of banter between Ellie and Bill, and Bill's introduction also services the relationship between Joel and Ellie, which they also do in the show, but in a different way. And I was really looking forward to all that stuff with Bill in the game being shown on TV. But all that stuff is omitted in favor of this love story. And while I do like the love story on its own, that's also my problem with it, is that on its own, it's great, but within the context of the rest of the season, this episode feels detached and disconnected. This episode is the one that out of all the episodes in the season, this one feels the most out of place. They also kind of do it in episode 7, where we see the story between Ellie and Riley, but I'm willing to give that one a little more slack because at the very least, it features one of our main characters. This episode just focuses on 2 side characters, one of whom wasn't super important to the overall story, and the other who was hardly in the story at all. However, all things considered, I did really like this story. A lot of people talk about how the story is super sad, and I don't really understand that because it's not really sad as much as it is tragically beautiful. Because in the end, when Bill and Frank both commit suicide, they even say in the show how it isn't a tragic suicide at the end of the play, and how this is objectively very romantic. It's very Romeo and Juliet-esque, and this story ends with both having grown to old age and being satisfied with going. So the 2 of them going together isn't really sad to me because this is probably like the best case dream scenario for a lot of people during the apocalypse. So it's not really sad to me, but it is super emotional, and some of the shots are downright beautiful. Like, they just exude warmth and soft light and colors. I particularly like this shot of Bill and Frank getting married because I remember when I was watching this, I thought to myself how much this looked like both a wedding and a funeral, which I thought was apropos given that Frank was on his last day. It was actually quite shocking because at this point, I didn't actually realize how similar the 2 events were in presentation.
I was told it was a wedding. I showed
very
up to the
event,
wedding.
a very somber wedding.
Cover your ears. And I was like, where's Robert?
One thing that didn't really make sense to me though is when Bill and Frank first kiss, because I feel like as if it happened a little too quickly. Like, Bill is a guy who has spent years not trusting people and living on his own, slowly growing more bitter and secluded by the day. But when Frank shows up, it takes all but a few hours for them to kiss and end up in bed together, which I figured would happen eventually, but I didn't think a person like Bill would open himself up to that for at least a few days or even a few weeks. I thought the relationship between the two would build slowly, especially considering how Bill was. But then again, I have always been told that the gays work fast, so what the hell do I know? Other than that, I thought the story was told pretty perfectly, and I didn't really have any problems with it up until the very end with the double suicide. I mentioned before how much it reminded me of Romeo and Juliet and how it was very tragically romantic, but I also have some other thoughts on it as far as how they changed it from the game. See, because in the game, when we first meet Bill, Frank is already dead. He committed suicide, and we later find him with Bill, where Frank left a letter to Bill pretty similar to the one that Bill left for Joel in the show, where it says that Frank didn't really like Bill, and Bill is sort of just left to figure out how to cope with that. In the game, the relationship between the two is a lot more strained, and it leads to Bill becoming resentful. However, in the show, the relationship is a lot more loving, which is why when Frank chooses to die at the end, Bill decides to join him. I was initially a bit skeptical at this change because this makes Bill into a completely different person, but they end up doing it in a way that kind of still works for me. See, because at one point in the game, Bill says to Joel that he once had somebody that he cared about, a partner, that being Frank, and he says that all that shit's good for is getting you killed, which is why Bill thinks that Joel isn't going to make it, because he sees the relationship Joel has with Ellie and it reminds him of the relationship he had with Frank. In the game, Bill being this resentful, lonely, and closed-off man serves to show the player and Joel what Joel could potentially become if he went down the path Bill went down and just didn't care about anybody but himself. But in the show, Bill leaves Joel a note talking about his relationship with Frank and how men like them exist for a reason, and that's to protect people like Frank and Ellie. In the game, Bill exists to show what Joel could be, but in the television series, Bill exists to show what Joel should be. And that's where I'm a little conflicted, because while the two scenarios have vastly different implications, they both still serve to mirror Bill and Frank's relationship, with Joel and Ellie's relationship. It's just that one serves as a warning, while the other serves as an example. Your mileage may vary on which one you like better, but I think both work effectively enough for what they aim to do. So next episode, we're back with Joel and Ellie, and they're headed into Kansas City. And this is where I started appreciating both Joel and Ellie a bit more, mainly because I feel like this episode is where they really start bonding and building a relationship. Their banter is cute and lighthearted, and if I wasn't smiling at how cute they were, I was laughing at the jokes. And that's one thing with this show, is that I feel like it's actually funnier than the game, which I can appreciate because I always love it when a series or a movie can effectively mix sharp, witty humor with dark, brutal action and not have the two different tones clash with one another. One thing I didn't really like, though, is some of the stuff they chose to omit. Like when Joel and Ellie see that guy pretending to be hurt to lead them into an ambush, they left out the line Joel says where he goes, "Oh, he ain't even hurt." There were some really cool action scenes they left out too, like the guys pulling Joel and Ellie out of the car during the ambush. There was the part where Joel falls down the elevator shaft, but the biggest thing I felt like they changed was the pivotal scene where Ellie uses a gun to save Joel's life, which leads to Joel trusting her with a gun. Because when we got to that scene and Joel was taken down and I saw Ellie sneak up behind the guy, I was thinking, oh, we're at this part already? Because like I said, there were a few action scenes that they left out, so I was surprised they skipped all that and just got to this part already. I did like, however, the way they did the scene where Ellie shoots this guy attacking Joel and the guy begs for his life before being killed. I think it really helped show the violent reality of murder, and not just for the victim, but for everyone involved. However, I didn't really like the scene afterwards with the two of them alone in that boarded up building, which which I know is a bit of a hot take because it seems like that scene was one of the scenes that was praised the most, because in the game, after Ellie shoots and kills Joel's attacker, Joel reprimands Ellie for disobeying him and using a gun, to which Ellie fires back how he should be grateful she didn't listen and saved his life. It's a scene that I think could have been acted out beautifully by Pedro and Bella, and like I said, it leads to Joel eventually trusting Ellie with a gun. However, in the show, after Joel's attacker dies, Joel's a lot more compassionate and empathetic towards Ellie, and even apologizes for her needing to do that. I mentioned before how I'm always a bit skeptical when you make changes like this to a character, and I feel like this time it didn't really work as well as it did with Bill. Speaking of characters that didn't work, let's now talk about the villain of this little arc, Kathleen, because I'll be honest, I did not really care about Kathleen. I understand why she needed to exist because they needed an opposing force to our team of heroes, but I just did not care. Even with her backstory, I really couldn't care less about her. Neil Druckmann mentioned in the post-episode analysis how he really loves to humanize villains and try to make the audience sympathize with them, and I'll tell you what, it really did not work. Not now, and not ever. I'm serious, I watched other people react to this arc, and everybody universally wanted Kathleen to die by the end, regardless of how justified she might have been feeling the way she felt. Because that's the thing about people, is even if we understand what you're trying to go for, there's no saying that it's going to work. We might just have such a connection to our main characters that our love for them will outweigh any rationalization you can make for them needing to suffer, and will lead to us hating the people responsible for making them suffer. Anyways, Kathleen's scenes didn't really work for me, and if anything, just kind of started ruining the pace of this episode. But this episode ends with Henry and Sam holding Joel and Ellie at gunpoint, and that leads us into the next episode, which might be my favorite of the whole season, and if it's not, it's at least the runner-up. The next episode gives us the Sam and Henry arc in The Last of Us story, and it's probably my favorite storyline, if not the runner-up, and I'll tell you what my other favorite storyline is later, although you could probably guess what it is by now. But the episode starts with a little backstory and context on Sam and Henry and how they eventually met Joel and Ellie. And I do kind of like this because the time that we spend with Sam and Henry helps us connect with the characters, and Lamar Johnson and Kayvon Woodard do a fantastic job, both as their characters and making their characters likable to the audience. They almost do too good of a job, because the farther we got into this episode, the more I actively tried not to get too attached to these two, having played the game before and knowing what would happen to them. One change I really liked though was the change they made to Sam, where they made him deaf and younger than he looked in the game, because it makes him more reliant on Henry, thereby making Henry lean into his protector role even more, which makes us, the audience, like Henry even more, and I guess by extension, Sam. Neil Druckmann even said in the post-episode analysis that he wished he had thought of making Sam that way when he made the game, but Sam and Henry meet Joel and Ellie, they make plans to escape the city. They reach that one classroom underground where we get a really nice scene of Ellie and Sam just getting to be kids, and Henry explains to Joel why Kathleen is hunting him down. I already explained why I don't really care for Kathleen, so this scene, as well as the next one where we get to see things from Kathleen's perspective a bit, didn't really do anything for me as far as humanizing Kathleen. They were still interesting and thought-provoking though, with the way they played with moral perspective, like one person's good, maybe another person's evil. Anyways, our gang makes it out from underground and we get that really cool sniper scene from the game. Kathleen and her boys find our heroes, and it leads to probably the most intense action scene so far, where infected flood the cul-de-sac and attack everyone on the streets. And that's one thing about this action scene and action scenes in general with this series, is that they're really good with intensity. Everything from the super sudden flooding of infected, to how the infected go after people, to putting the audience into the action with the people fighting off the infected. Because the thing with the game is that since we're playing as Joel, when that scene happens, we're watching the whole thing from Joel's perspective, which is already intense enough with the player trying to snipe all the enemies going after our crew, but because Joel's sort of tucked away in the house, it's not really as intense as the TV show, where we're shown both with Joel's perspective, like in the game, but we're also thrown straight into the fire by being shown things from down below, where all the action is, from the perspective of both our heroes and our villains. And one of the villains in Kathleen's right-hand man, Perry, gets one of the best death sequences when a bloater is introduced in the show for the first time and does the gnarly kill animation from the video game, where it brute force rips your face in half, which I popped so hard for, because those little details, man, that's what I'm here for. But this whole big action scene ends with Kathleen getting jumped by an infected. And our heroes escape Kansas City, and honestly, we could have just ended it there, and I would have been happy, but no. Once I saw that there were still 10 or 15 minutes left, I knew what was coming. We get Sam and Henry's death scene, and they changed the part where Sam shows Ellie his bite mark, because in the game, he doesn't show Ellie that he's infected, and Ellie finds out the next morning when Sam attacks her in surprise. But I do kind of like that in the show. They changed it so that Ellie tries to use her blood as medicine for Sam when she sees his bite mark. That whole scene of Ellie promising to stay up with Sam and comforting him made his death way more emotional and heartbreaking. So I really do like that change. And that's the thing generally with changes, is that I'm okay with changes that add or emphasize things that may only be mildly introduced in the source material. I'm okay with changes like Sam being deaf and Ellie seeing Sam's bite mark and trying to save him, because it makes his already heartbreaking death even more heartbreaking with these changes. I tend to be more skeptical of changes when they completely change what the source material was trying to do, like the scene of Joel trusting Ellie with a gun. But the final scene of Sam attacking Ellie, Henry being forced to kill his own brother and then shooting himself out of grief, and Ellie leaving Sam's notepad on his grave with the words "I'm sorry" written on it before abruptly leaving with Joel as the episode fades to black is absolutely perfect. I have nothing to say about that last part. The performances are as good as they can be, all the little things from the suddenness of Sam's death, just one shot to the head, the fact that it's pure silence after Sam is shot and all we hear is our heroes' labored breathing, the tension in the scene as Henry processes that he's just killed his brother, something that becomes even sadder when you remember before when Henry says he's almost never gotten violent with another person before. All this stuff makes this part arguably even more tragic than the game, and it leaves the viewer feeling fucking miserable. And maybe I'm just broken inside, but oof, that's exactly the kind of stuff I love, is this bleak shit that just bums you out and leaves you feeling depressed and miserable. This was the part of the story that really made me appreciate The Last of Us 10 years ago, and this was the part of the story that now makes me think about how good of an adaptation this is, and how good of a TV show this is in general. I'd seen some people getting a bit overwhelmed at this scene and saying how this show is just too much, and I love that shit. It just shows how effective these story beats were 10 years ago, and it's nice to see that they still hold up today. So then we get to the next episode, episode 6, and this is the part where Joel and Ellie find Tommy and the settlement he's been living in. And one change from the game I do like is that this show adds in the fact that Joel suffers from panic attacks, and like I said before, I like it when a change helps add to a character, and this change adds to Joel's fear that he's going to fail as a protector again and get Ellie killed. So Joel and Ellie are found by Tommy's people, they're brought in, hey look, there's Dina. Joel and Tommy argue over Tommy not taking Ellie off Joel's hands because he's got a life now. Ellie and Maria talk about Joel's past and his deceased daughter Sarah, which I love is in the show because it was mentioned in the game how Ellie and Maria talked about Joel's daughter, but they never outright showed it, and now we get to see what that conversation might have looked like. They also talk about Joel's shady past in general, and Maria warns Ellie against trusting Joel, saying that you can only be betrayed by the people you trust, which is something that's going to play a part at the end of the season and in the next game or the next season. But Joel pleads with Tommy again to take Ellie out of fear that he's going to fail her like he failed Sarah, and Pedro Pascal's performance in this scene is fantastic. We trim some of the fat out of the game where Ellie runs away and you have to fight through a bunch of people both before and after your interactions with her to continue the story. story, which I don't mind because that stuff wasn't super important. But the most important scene in this part of the story was done to perfection when Ellie confronts Joel about leaving her, since everybody she's ever loved has either left her or died, and that he doesn't have to be afraid of losing her since she's not Sarah. And Joel agrees that she's not his daughter and that he sure as hell ain't her dad before leaving her. That shit was so good. It's one of those scenes from the game that just had to be done right, and Pedro and Bella nailed it. It was so spot on that I was able to literally say the words along with the characters as the scene was happening, because I've watched that scene so many times that I know that conversation by heart. Being able to quote the scene with the characters as I was watching this for the first time just made me so happy. And this was the scene that kind of sold me on Pedro and Bella being our Joel and Ellie, if there was any doubt left in my mind. But the next morning, Joel gives Ellie the choice to go with him or not. She doesn't even hesitate, and we get some really cute scenes of them bonding the way a dad and a daughter would. I swear, some of their scenes, like this one where Joel shows Ellie how to shoot, are so cute because you can see the moments of Ellie acting like a daughter by complaining and getting all whiny about how the gun doesn't work and leaning on Joel's back as she rides on the horse behind him. And Joel, for his part, really starts acting like a dad too by teaching Ellie how to hold a gun and teaching her about football, and it's all just so freaking cute. You can really see this is the moment where they bond and they start leaning into their respective roles in their daddy-daughter relationship. They eventually make it to the university where they find it abandoned and Joel is grievously injured by an attacker. And I gotta talk about this part because I don't totally love this part, because in the game, the way Joel gets injured is way worse. He's pretty much pushed off a balcony and impaled through a bit of rebar when he lands, and the scene of Ellie slowly ripping Joel out of the rebar and practically carrying his ass out of the university while fending off attackers is so tense because you don't know if Joel is going to survive or how Ellie is going to do now that the roles are reversed, or if they're even going to make it back to the horse. It's really intense and plays with a lot of stuff like the visuals getting blurred and the audio being muffled, and I feel like you could have translated that really well over to TV. But in the show, Joel kind of just takes the piece of bat he was impaled with out of his midsection and they just get on the horse and run off, and it just doesn't feel nearly as impactful or scary. But either way, Joel passes out from either shock or blood loss, and the episode ends with Ellie trying to wake him up while telling him that she doesn't know what to do without him. So the next episode is the DLC from the game, the mini story within the game entitled Left Behind. And if they were going to include this bit in the TV show, this was the perfect place to do it, because the game shows this story happening as a flashback during the events of Joel getting injured. I will say though, and I mentioned this a bit before with the Bill and Frank episode, but episodes like this, at least for me, tend to ruin the pacing a bit of the overall season. Because the main story is this journey of Joel and Ellie, and each episode shows the slow progression of their adventure. So to have episodes tucked in between where the main story is just brought to a full halt can be kind of frustrating for impatient people like me who just want to see what happens next. But like I said before, I'm willing to cut this episode a little slack because at the very least focuses on one of our main characters, and like the Bill and Frank episode, we get to see how this side story plays a part in and connects back to the main story. But in this episode, we see Ellie at military school and her roommate Riley comes back to her after running away to join the Fireflies. And I will say that one thing I didn't like was the dialogue between Ellie and Riley in the first half of the episode, because there's a good chunk of it spent on their opposing ideologies regarding the Fireflies and whether they're terrorists or not, and how the school they go to is the only thing holding everything together, and I just could not be more uninterested in this conversation. I just kept thinking about what it was going to look like when they got to the mall. But when they did eventually get to the mall, that's when shit got good, because Ellie and Riley go on a little date, and so much of this shit is so cute. Everything from Ellie riding down the escalator to Ellie fixing her hair to look good for Riley, to their carousel ride, to the photo booth, to the arcade. It's just such a cute date. And then we get to Riley telling Ellie that she has to leave her, them dancing, Ellie pleading with her not to go, and they kiss before it gets interrupted by an infected who bites both Ellie and Riley. And I gotta say that the scene where Ellie finds out she's been bitten is acted out so well by Bella. Then the conversation between Riley and Ellie where they come to terms with their inevitable deaths is just performed to perfection by both Storm Reid and again Bella. And I really like how, once again, like Bill and Frank, Riley and Ellie's relationship mirrors Joel and Ellie's relationship, with Ellie realizing in the present how Riley fought for the time she had left with her, which means that she can't leave Joel despite his possibly not surviving his injury, and how, like her last moments with Riley, even if she only gets 2 more minutes or 2 more days with Joel, she doesn't give that up. One thing I really like throughout pretty much every Last of Us property are the paralleling relationships. Naughty Dog does a really good job with paralleling relationships throughout both the games and the TV show, and you see it here again with Ellie's relationships with both Joel and Riley. Then we get to the next episode, and whoo boy, was this the episode I was waiting for since Sam and Henry. Because I said before that there was maybe one other storyline in the first Last of Us game that was as good as the Sam and Henry arc, and that is the David arc. Honestly, sometimes I like it better than the Sam and Henry arc, depending on how I'm feeling on the day. Because I've said many a times before on this channel that I love messed up shit. And Sam and Henry's story was messed up in a sort of tragic way, but David's story is messed up in a very disturbing way. The episode starts with a brief introduction to David and his cult, and Ellie goes out to hunt for food. She spots a deer, and I like how they do this shot with close-ups on both the deer and Ellie to build the intimacy and intensity of the moment. Then as Ellie tracks her kill, she finds David and James about to take it for themselves. And I have to commend Bella's acting here again, because I was trying to figure out why at first the dialogue exchange between the two sounded so weird, but then I realized that Ellie has never been in a situation like this before where she's had to threaten strangers with a gun, because up until this point, Joel has been taking care of her and handling it all for them. So it makes perfect sense that Ellie sounds so stilted and awkward in this scene, because this is probably her first time in a situation like this. And Bella does such a great job with this scene because you can just hear the inexperience in Ellie's voice, her body movement, and her whole demeanor towards David and James. But Ellie offers to trade them the deer for some medicine for Joel. James runs off to fetch it, and Ellie and David take shelter from the cold. Then Ellie and the audience find out that the guy that injured Joel and was killed by him was part of David's crew, and when I heard that they were already doing this reveal, I was a little surprised. Because in the game, Ellie spends a lot more time with David, fending off infected with him and even having him save her at one point. So after all that, when they finally do this reveal, it's a lot more surprising, because both the player and Ellie grow to trust David a bit more than we did in the TV show. And that's the main issue I have with this episode, is the pacing, and you'll see where that comes into play again later in the episode. But for what this scene serves to do, it just feels like it happens way too fast, and as a result, it makes the reveal much less impactful and surprising. Honestly, you could have just had Ellie and David kill a couple of infected together before you did this scene, and I would have been happier, because for a guy who you just met maybe 10-15 minutes ago, to come out as potentially an enemy of yours means almost nothing, because in this world, just about every stranger could potentially be an enemy of yours. What more time together does is it builds that possibility of friendship, which makes ripping that possibility away later during this reveal scene much more impactful. What I do like though is some of the background they decide to give to David that wasn't in the game, like the fact that David was a teacher before all this, which makes certain implications much more horrifying when we find out more about his character later on. But David and James let Ellie go. Ellie goes back to Joel and gives him the medicine, and they have this really cute scene together. Ellie finds the next morning that they tracked her and they eventually capture her. Joel, on the other hand, is forced to start fending for himself again, and they do this really great intimate death scene where you watch this guy slowly die in front of Joel. And Joel's like a total badass in this episode, because he straight up tortures David's guys to find out where they took Ellie, and the torture scene is is just as brutal and as cool as it was in the game. But when Ellie wakes up after being captured, she has a very interesting conversation with David that wasn't in the game about the parallels between them when it comes to the violence they must exercise in order to survive. And it's also really interesting hearing David speak and finding out almost how he came to have the sort of mindset that he does. But David comes out as a pedophile and a cannibal. Boy, man, you're just checking all the boxes, aren't you? And right as they're about to start chopping up Ellie reveals that she's infected, which distracts them long enough for Ellie to kill James. Sorry, I know he's supposed to be a bad guy, but every time I saw this guy, I just couldn't take him seriously as a bad guy, knowing that he voiced Joel in the game, and he just made me smile every time I saw him. But David chases Ellie into that diner, and I've got a lot to say about this whole scene, because from Ellie using a piece of smoking wood and screaming as she's sneaking up behind David to kill him, this girl just doesn't know how to do stealth. I mean, she would never survive this boss fight in the game if permadeath was on. But when David pins Ellie down and threatens to rape her, look, I've mentioned many times now how I've just been so impressed with Bella's acting, but they just took it to a whole nother level here. Because from the blood-curdling scream, which makes you feel Ellie's terror, helplessness, despair, pain, and rage, to Ellie just hacking away at David before settling back with the most shell-shocked, traumatized expression I've ever seen, with the whole diner just burning around her. This was the moment that pretty much solidified Bella as the definitive Ellie. If there was even a shadow of a doubt anymore about whether Bella could convince you that they were Ellie, it should have been gone at this moment. This is Ellie to an absolute T. There is no doubt about it anymore. I mean, sure, I still don't think Bella necessarily looks like Ellie. That hasn't really changed, but at this point, that difference is so deeply overshadowed by Bella's performance of the character that it almost doesn't even matter. And that's why when it comes to my initial suspicions about whether an actor can convince me of being a character or not, I'm actually glad to be wrong in moments like this because I don't lose anything by being wrong. I'm glad to be wrong about my skepticism over Bella playing Ellie, because in the end, I got somebody who I'm proud to call my Ellie, and it only makes me more excited to see them play the character further in the future. But anyways, these last few seconds in the diner are just perfect. Up until they cut to Ellie walking out of the diner. Because I was so happy at how perfect this scene was, this was pretty much shot for shot what happened in the game, which is exactly how they should have done it. And in some ways, it's even more brutal and horrifying than the game with some of the dialogue they decided to add in, and I was so happy at how this was playing out until I saw Ellie walk out of the diner by herself, because that is not what happens in the game. Because in the game, as Ellie is hacking away at David, Joel pulls Ellie off of him, and they do the whole scene that Bella and Pedro did at the end of the episode. But in the show, Ellie walks out of the diner first before Joel finds her, and then they do their whole scene together. Now, it's just a minor change, right? Well, yeah, but this goes back to what I was saying before about pacing. The way the game does it is so much better because those last moments between Ellie and David are so intense and as a result fast-paced that Joel finding her and consoling her as it's happening ensures that there are no breaks in the intensity. It's just emotional moment after emotional moment after emotional moment, one right after the other. No stops, no pauses, just a continuous flow to the end. Also, with the danger that was so present just a second before Joel arrived, Joel's appearance is almost a bit jarring when you see him, and all of a sudden you're just flooded with relief, realizing that you're finally safe. But with the TV show, when you have Ellie walk out of the diner after this emotional, intense, fast-paced scene, you break that continuous flow. Because having killed David, the viewer is able to almost breathe for a second, knowing that the main threat has been neutralized. This allows the viewer to collect themselves and calm down a bit first before we jump into this next emotional scene with Joel, which isn't inherently bad, but Joel's appearance isn't nearly as jarring or significant because we already feel safe having had that second to collect ourselves after killing David. And that's the problem with this episode in general, is the pacing. Some scenes feel too rushed, while others feel like they're not rushed enough. But the episode ends with Joel and Ellie reuniting, and this scene again just solidifies Pedro and Bella as Joel and Ellie with how well this is acted out. From Ellie crying out and still trying to fight when Joel grabs her before slowly calming down and realizing that it's him, only to be so traumatized after what's happened that she just starts babbling incoherently to Joel before hugging him, and Joel delivering his infamous line of calling her his baby girl, something that he hasn't called anybody since Sarah died. Perfection. Absolutely perfect. What a great episode. And then we get to the finale. And I was surprised when I saw beforehand that the episode was only going to be 45 minutes long. I thought, damn, the finale is only 45 minutes? I thought it could have potentially been the longest episode in the season, given the fact that it's supposed to cover some additional stuff that was never shown in the game. And one of those things was how this episode started off, with a pregnant Ellie running through the woods to give birth to Ellie. I'm sorry, I know this was supposed to be a serious scene, but like what happened before with Troy Baker playing James from the last episode, seeing Ashley Johnson play Ellie's mom, Anna, just made me so happy. Then we see Joel and Ellie finishing up their journey, and I love how the dynamic has sort of reversed from Ellie being the talkative one to Joel being it now, with Ellie traumatized from her encounter with David, and Pedro and Bella both do a great job portraying that dynamic. They do that great draft scene from the game where we get a brief respite from the journey and we just get a wholesome moment of Ellie playing with the giraffe as Joel looks on, happy to see her finally smiling and returning a bit to how she was before she met David. And I gotta talk about the giraffe because I swore when I saw this, I thought this shit was CG'd. I can't explain it, but it just looks so fake. And apparently, I wasn't the only one thinking this because I saw a lot of people swearing on God that this giraffe was totally fake. But as it turns out, it's totally real, and everything else around it is fake. So that's pretty funny. Anyways, they get a sweet moment with the giraffe, and Joel tries to convince Ellie to just abandon the mission and go back to Tommy's. And the moment of Ellie insisting that they finish what they started with the music turning triumphant and more intense at that moment was Goosebumps City. I also loved the addition they made with Joel revealing that he tried to take his own life after Sarah died and that he finally got over it, healed, and moved on because of Ellie. And ooh, man, that moment was so beautiful. I think that was the moment when Ellie and Joel finally realized how much they meant to each other. And when you remember how they were with each other when this all started, you start to see why this is one of the most beautiful stories and relationships developed in all of media, and why the end of this season plays out the way that it does. I do have to say though that even though I love the way this relationship between Joel and Ellie developed both in the game and on the show, I think the game just felt more real, and I don't know, I was just hit a lot harder by the game. That could just be because the game was longer, and due to that, you get to spend more time with the characters while the show condenses the most important bits from the game, and that's why Joel and Ellie's relationship doesn't feel as hard-hitting, but all things considered, I still liked how the show did it. But Ellie starts telling Joel more of her puns, and I'm not proud to say that it took me about 3 tellings of that grape joke for me to finally get it. But Joel and Ellie are incapacitated by a grenade and taken to the Fireflies, and I knew that was how it was going to go down because they showed the grenade in the preview during the last episode, and I remembered thinking there was no grenade thrown at them during the last part of the game. So what is that for? Then I figured they probably needed some way to incapacitate Joel and Ellie so that they could be separated and taken to the Fireflies, because in the game, they go through this whole thing where they get trapped in a bus that fills up with water, and because Ellie can't swim, she drowns while Joel tries to pull her out of the bus, and the Fireflies find Joel trying to revive her, and they do what they do in the show by knocking him out and separating them. I get why they probably didn't do that because of budget constraints and all that, and having to create a really complicated set piece when they just as easily could get to the same endpoint in a much more efficient manner, so it doesn't really bother me that much. But still, I feel like you could have added something here before we see the Fireflies, if for no other reason than to fill up more time given how short this episode was already. Some more time could have also been dedicated to the next scene where Marlene tells Joel that Ellie must be killed in order to create this cure, because they briefly go over it where Marlene says that she does understand Joel's pain, but they cut a lot of the dialogue from the game where Joel asks Marlene why she's allowing this to happen, and Marlene says that it's not about what she wants and that it's about the fate of the world and how Joel shouldn't waste this gift. Again, this little bit of dialogue could have added to this scene, and this episode could have used it with its runtime, but I digress. It was in this scene, however, that I did come to appreciate the opening to this episode with Marlene meeting Ellie literally at birth when she found Anna, because it helps add to this scene and really emphasizes Marlene saying that she understands Joel's pain because she's known Ellie her whole life. And she says that in the game too, but the scene of Marlene meeting Ellie is not shown in the game, and it really helps in making this part more impactful. But Joel starts to be let out, he takes out the Fireflies with him, and he just starts going full out John Wick on the rest of the hospital. And this kind of montage is exactly the type of thing they could have shown in other parts of the season, like what I was saying before with the part where Ellie and David fend off infected together being shown in the game but not in the show. You just as easily could take a long portion of gameplay from the game and shorten it like this for the show. But Joel runs through the hospital, kills the doctor, and carries Ellie out of the hospital, and the end is basically exactly how it plays out in the game, where Marlene stops Joel before he leaves and tries to convince him to do the right thing for humanity, but Joel caps her, lies to Ellie about how and why he left with her, and tells her that her immunity means nothing, and the season ends with Ellie insisting that Joel promise her that he wasn't lying about what he told her, which Joel does, and we see Ellie stand there, doubt in her eyes, probably knowing that he is in fact lying to her, but not wanting to accept it because for the person that she loves the most to deny her her purpose, deny her her choice to save humanity, that possibility is too horrifying to fathom. So Ellie simply accepts with an okay, and we cut to black. What a fucking story, what a fucking game, what a fucking show. When this final episode came out, there was a lot of debate about this ending and whether Joel did the right thing or not. I mean, apparently there was some discourse online and some people were mad at this ending. And all I gotta say is, if they were mad at this...
Honey, you've got a big storm coming.
Honestly, at the end of the day, this game has one of my favorite stories across all of media, and easily is my favorite story in video games. And seeing people enjoy this as much as me, especially the people who haven't played the game, and seeing them fall in love with this story the same way I did 10 years ago is so freaking cool. Again, I said this earlier, but the fact that this story can generate the same type of response and emotion from people the way that it did a whole decade ago shows just how well this story holds up. When this show was announced, some people were saying how they really weren't that excited for it because they felt like it was just going to be a rehash of the same story that we already experienced from the video game. And to some degree, I do understand that, but I also think the people making this show did a good job not only adapting, but expanding on the material that they were given. And since video games are more of a niche medium than TV is, I'm also really glad this television adaptation exists because it helped show a whole new audience what they were missing out on for so long. In the end, this television show definitely stands out as being one of the better video game adaptations out there. Besides the perfect story, which I've gone on about ad nauseum at this point, it has great cinematography, incredibly well-developed and realistic characters, amazing writing, intense action sequences, clever bits of humor, beautifully horrifying makeup and prosthetics. The score, which is quite literally transferred over from the game, is as moving as ever. The production design is fantastic, and any problems that I might have had with it, like the pacing, is honestly so minimal in the grand scheme of things that it almost doesn't even really affect how much I like it. So in the end, I'm gonna give season 1 of The Last of Us a 9.5 out of 10. And after this banger of a first season, it's recently been announced that there will be at least more than one season dedicated to the second video game in The Last of Us series. So as a huge fan of The Last of Us, did The Last of Us Part 2 uphold the legacy of the first game? No, it fucking did not. I hate this game. I remember when this game first came out a few months into the pandemic and everybody played it because we were still at that stage where nobody was really doing anything outside, and holy shit, some of the reactions to this.
Fuck this game, dude.
No,
dude. I don't want to play as this bitch anymore. What the fuck has this game become? Please.
I mean, it probably would have been bad enough already, but add in the fact that we were going through a real-life pandemic, like the pandemic in the world of The Last of Us, and it was pretty much over. People were already upset, and this game did them no favors. I was afraid this would happen too. In the days leading up to the game's release, I started getting anxious, thinking about whether or not this game would do the first game justice. The last thing I wanted to happen was for this game to be so bad that it would start to ruin my opinion of the first game, because like I said, that first game stands as the best game from a storytelling perspective that I have ever played. And while that didn't completely happen, as I still love the first game as much as I always have, there's still that little thing in the back of my mind reminding me that this game still exists. And whenever I'm reminded of that, I just get upset. There are whole chunks of this game that I've suppressed from my memory. Entire chunks of this game that I have no recollection of. I had to go back and watch YouTube playthroughs to remember what happened in this story, because I sure as hell was not going to go back and play this game again. Forget the obvious plot point that you might have heard by now. Forget that thing that was going to piss people off regardless. There are so many other things to hate about this second game. A story that doesn't play out chronologically, which is already messy and confusing enough as is, but add in the fact that they literally put in flashbacks within flashbacks, and then once the first flashback starts playing again, you get more flashbacks within that flashback, and you can't even remember where you were before the first flashback even began. Characters that we don't care about or don't get nearly enough character development, mainly due to the fact that these flashbacks already allude the audience to their fates before we even meet them. Plot points that you spend a great deal of time on only for them to end in a way that is not satisfying or completely pointless. I mean it, some plot lines end up being completely pointless. A tone that lacks any sort of beauty, humor, or cuteness that the first game had, which results in the whole game feeling miserable and not in a cool way. This game is awful, guys. This is exactly what I was afraid of. I would have been okay if we had just left The Last of Us as a standalone game, but you had to show me this, and now I can't think about how amazing that first game was without thinking about this bullshit. I don't want to do this again, you guys. I don't want to see all the discourse and all this shit start back up again, because I thought it was gone forever back in 2020.